in the last part, I said it was time to go to Santiago de Compostela to look for answers. And you might reasonably thinking at this point, what possible answers could there be? Like, surely we've covered everything there is to know about Santiago. But actually, I still have some unresolved questions. So let's start with the Order of the Way of St. James. This is the organization that placed the plaque and the statue in the Church of Santiago de Tlatelolco. I believe that there is no connection between the Order of the Way of St. James, which is a sort of tourist agency that promotes the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, and the Order of St. James, the ancient order of knights dedicated to protecting pilgrimage routes and fighting Muslims. Although I would like to ask them if there's any connection, because the names are very similar, and I do also want to get back to the Order of St. James later. The thing is, this isn't the only statue of St. James that I've seen in Mexico. There's quite a similar statue outside the Church of Our Lady of Remedies in Cholula. This church is really impressive. It towers over Cholula, which is really beautiful, by the way. And it's actually built on top of the biggest Mesoamerican pyramid ever discovered. It's enormous. But the pyramid, to be fair to the Spanish, was covered with soil, and they thought that it was just a mountain when the church was built. But now that we've had a look at it, it's actually an enormous temple, but of an earlier civilization to the Aztecs. And already when the Aztecs were building their temple, that temple had been covered with earth and was not used anymore, which is kind of amazing. But anyway. But there's a mountain with a church, and at the base of the mountain is a really small chapel with this very eye-catching mural of Santiago, who's sort of is poised to attack anyone who enters. And then once you climb up the mountain, which is quite a long climb, you get to the main church, and there's a statue of Santiago outside the church, which is, I think, suspiciously similar to the one in Santiago de Tlatelolco. When I visited, I actually couldn't go inside, which was really annoying, but it was just because there was a service and the church was so packed that people were spilling out of the main doors. I would love to know if St. James is also represented inside the church. Most Mexican churches don't have statues of St. James or murals or anything. It's actually quite unusual. And I know this because I've walked into every Mexican church I passed obsessively in every village and traveled around Mexico a bit at this point. And the churches of Santiago de Tlatelolco and Our Lady of Remedies in Cholula are the only two churches where I've really seen St. James prominently displayed, except for a few smaller ones that I went to in the south of Mexico City. The church in Cholula is the only church outside Mexico City I have found so far that also displays St. James. And this is significant to me because of events in Cholula during the conquest. Some important context to this as well is that there were no draft animals in Mesoamerica before the conquest. The Aztecs didn't have horses, mules, donkeys, oxen, so they had to carry everything by hand. And a large number of porters would accompany people as a baggage train, certainly when the Spanish were marching around as an army. So let's read an account of this event, of what happened in Cholula, again by Fray Bartolome de las Casas. One of the slaughters they perpetrated was in the most spacious city of Cholula, which consisted of 30,000 families. All the chief rulers of that region and neighbouring places, starting with the priests and their high priests, met the Spaniards in pomp and state. The Inyads gave the Spaniards a more reverential and honourable reception, leading them to settle in the city and to entertain them in the apartments of the most powerful and principal noblemen. The Spaniards agreed to slaughter, or castigate as they term it, Indians right there to instil fear and bravery in every corner of the region, for in all the countries that they came, they took this course. Once they arrived, they committed notorious butcheries, which made those innocent sheep tremble in fear. For this purpose they called the governors and nobles of the cities, and all the places subject to them, together with their supreme lord. They told them they should all appear before them, and no sooner did they attend in expectation of some capitulation or discourse with the Spanish commander, but they were presently seized upon and detained prisoners before anyone could advertise or give them notice of their captivity. They demanded of them 5 or 6 thousand Indians to carry their baggage, and as soon as they came, the Spaniards locked them in backyards. It was a pity to see these Indians when they appeared to carry the load, because they were naked. Their bodies were only covered with a net over their shoulders containing their food. They were all in a squatting position, as meek lambs all together in the courtyard. Then the Spanish guards, who were armed, entered into the backyard, and with swords and spears they did spare not one. No Indian was able to escape without being chopped. But after 2 or 3 days, some of the Indians who hid among the dead bodies covered with blood presented themselves to the Spaniards, imploring their mercy and the prolongation of their lives with tears in their eyes and all imaginable submission. Yet the Spaniards, not in the least moved with pity or compassion, tore them into pieces. In the case of the chief governors, who were about 100 in number, the captain ordered them to be bound and affixed them to posts, and then burnt alive. They did that, and then they put St. James in the church above the city. I mean, what? Why is this? Why is this? Sorry, I got a bit emotional at the end of that last bit. I first saw St. James at Santiago de Tlatelolco, and I thought it was crazy he was still celebrated there. But when I saw St. James in Cholula, I just lost it. It was only after Cholula that I decided to make these videos. Anyway, I'd like to take a moment to talk about our primary sources. I introduced Bernal Diaz in part 5, a soldier who marched with Cortes and an invaluable eyewitness to the key events of the conquest. I read every section in which Santiago is mentioned, and I also read the description of the massacre at the Templo Mayor by Fray Bartolome de las Casas, in which he says a shout of Santiago was the signal to open fire on the festival. I've just read a second passage from Bartolome de las Casas' book, a short account of the destruction of the Indies, about events in Cholula, and I think we owe our second contemporary source, Bartolome de las Casas, a proper introduction. Bartolome was born in Seville around 1480. His uncle sailed with Christopher Columbus on his first voyage, and his father and brother sailed with Columbus on his second voyage, so it wasn't long before Bartolome joined the many Spaniards seeking fame and fortune in the New World, arriving on the island of Hispaniola in 1502. This is the island that is now partly Haiti and partly the Dominican Republic. There, he fought and eventually subdued the native people called the Taino. Columbus wrote about the Taino in his diary. They traded with us and gave us everything they had with good will. They took great delight in pleasing us. They are very gentle and without knowledge of what is evil, nor do they murder or steal. Your Highness may believe that in all the world there can be no better people. They love their neighbours as themselves, and they have the sweetest talk in the world, and are gentle and always laughing. We get the words hammock and barbecue from the Taino language. They gave us hammocks and barbecues, and we gave them forced labour, smallpox and cholera. Today, we would call what happened to the Taino a genocide. They were subject to forced labour, high taxes, and tortured by cutting off their hands if they couldn't find enough gold. There were up to 1 million Taino on Hispaniola when Columbus arrived in 1492. Their numbers were reduced to only 32,000 by 1514, 200 in 1565, and by 1802 the colonial authorities declared the people extinct. After the defeat of the last Taino chief in 1504, Bartolome de las Casas was rewarded with an encomienda, which was an area of land to rule, complete with the right to enslave and tax all the native people already living there. In 1506 he returned to Spain and was ordained as a priest. He is often called Fray Bartolomé de las Casas, the title Fray meaning friar in Spanish. In 1509 he returned to Hispaniola and resumed his management of his encomienda. 4 years later, in 1510, 4 priests of the Dominican order arrived on the island, and they were appalled at the treatment of the indigenous people. On Sunday, the 21st of December, 1511, Brother Antonio gave a fiery sermon, saying to his Spanish compatriots, "You are all in mortal sin, and in it you live and die, for the cruelty and tyranny with which you use these indigenous people. With what right do you impose such cruel and horrible servitude on these Indians? By what authority have you made such detestable wars on these people, who were meek and peaceful in their own lands? Where first they were infinite, how many of you consumed with death and havoc? You have made them so oppressed and weary, without feeding them or curing them of their diseases, that from the excessive labours you give them they die. These, aren't they men? Don't they have rational souls? Aren't you forced to love them like yourselves?" This sermon did not go down well, at all. The governor of the island, who was Christopher Columbus's son, called Diego, went in person to persuade the Dominicans to moderate their tone. The next Sunday, the sermon was, if anything, even more strident. The Dominicans preached that there are no racial differences in the eyes of God, that slavery and servitude are illegal, that Indians should be restored to their freedom and property, and that Indians should be converted to Christianity by example. They also denied communion and absolution to Fray Bartolomé de las Casas and everyone who had an encomienda and kept slaves. This hard line was untenable, and the Dominicans were forcefully expelled from the islands. Bartolomé de las Casas then joined an expedition to nearby Cuba and participated in the conquest of Cuba. This time, Bartolomé acted as a negotiator and a peacemaker, trying to persuade the Indians to lay down their arms, often after brutal fighting. He wrote later, "I saw here cruelty on a scale no living being has ever seen or expects to see." In one instance, after a massacre, he entered a village to try and restore calm. He found a young Indian man hiding in one of the huts and convinced him that the danger had passed and he could come out. The man was immediately stabbed as he left the hut by a soldier, and Bartolomé had only just enough time to baptize him before he died. Although he was often successful in pacifying the local tribes and winning converts to Christianity, he was becoming increasingly disillusioned with the methods of the conquest. He was frustrated that his role was limited to negotiation, and he had no authority over the soldiers, who were under the command of Panfilo Narvaez, the future governor of Cuba. This meant that agreements Bartolomé negotiated were often violated by his own side, resulting in the death of indigenous people who had placed their trust in him. He still did what he could to broker peace and save the lives he was able to. The conquest of Cuba was successful, and in 1514 Bartolomé was awarded with a larger encomienda in Cuba, rich in both gold and slaves, for his contributions. He immediately set his slaves to mine the gold deposits, gave a part of his wealth to the church, and had a life of luxury to look forward to. While he was preparing for Easter Mass, he was reading the Bible and came upon this passage. "He that sacrificeth a thing wrongly gotten, his offering is ridiculous, and the gifts of unjust men are not accepted. The Most High is not pleased with the offerings of the wicked, neither is he pacified for sin by the multitude of sacrifices. Whoso bringeth an offering of the goods of the poor doeth as one that killeth the son before his father's eyes. The bread of the needy is their life. He that defrauds him thereof is a man of blood." Ecclesiastes 34, verses 18 to 22 in the King James Bible. This passage in the Bible, his experiences during the conquest of Cuba, and the words of the Dominican brothers expelled from Hispaniola were too much for Bartolomé de las Casas. He made the courageous decision to renounce his encomienda, free his slaves, and give up his lands. He then dedicated the rest of his life to fighting for the rights of enslaved indigenous people in the Americas. He returned to Spain and began a multi-year campaign to convince the king to put an end to the enslavement of native people. He was opposed by powerful landowners and rich merchants. The enormous torrent of wealth arriving in Spain from the New World was enough to make most people look the other way. In 1516, Bartolome was granted an official office and the title of Protector of the Indians. In this role, he was responsible for the welfare of all indigenous people in the Spanish colonies, from Cuba and Mexico to Chile and Argentina. He received reports of crimes and campaigned for new laws to protect vulnerable indigenous populations. Although his position was somewhat symbolic, and he was generally ignored by the colonial authorities, Bartolome fought hard to improve the well-being of native peoples. Bartolome's tireless advocacy and his never-ending battles with other senior figures in the church and in court, many of whom were growing rich on incomes from encomiendas in the New World, did result in real and positive reform. The debate about whether indigenous people had souls and if they could be justly enslaved grew so hot that the Pope was forced to take sides. Sublimis Deus, the Sublime God, is a papal bull issued by Pope Paul III on June 2nd of 1537, which forbids the enslavement of the indigenous peoples of the Americas and all other indigenous peoples who could be discovered. It states that the Indians are fully rational human beings who have the rights to freedom and property, even if they are heathen. This bull was later withdrawn under pressure from the Spanish monarch, who argued it violated rights the Spanish had already been given by the papacy to colonize the New World without interference. Even so, the papal bull was influential and added to pressure for reforms to the encomienda system. Undaunted by these setbacks, Bartolome continued to campaign for reform and an end to the enslavement of indigenous people. He hoped to organize the indigenous Indians into self-governing towns that would pay taxes like any other citizens of the Spanish crown. Bartolome collected accounts of atrocities and massacres across the New World and published them in this book, a short account of the destruction of the Indies. It was written for an audience of one, King Philip II, who Bartolome hoped to cajole into action. He faced an interesting problem: whether to appeal to the better nature of the king and his natural sense of justice with flattery and kind words, or whether to directly accuse the king of complicity in atrocities and try to shame him into action. This is the approach Bartolome took. He begins with a bit of flattery to butter the king up for the request that is coming.
Right, I'm going to read a little bit of a short account of the destruction of the Indies. Just the preface that Bartolome wrote to the king. So he starts out, "Most high and potent Lord," good start, "because divine providence has ordered in this world that for the direction and common utility of the human lineage, the world be constituted by kingdoms and peoples, with their kings like fathers and shepherds, and therefore the most noble and generous members of the republics, and for that reason no doubt of the rectitude of the royal spirit of those kings may be held." So it's very old, and it has this old archaic style, even in translation. But he starts out by saying, "Oh, you're such a great king, kings are so great, we all really appreciate that we have a father or shepherd that looks after us." He then continues and quotes a bit of scripture. He quotes Solomon, saying, "The king that sitteth on the throne of judgment, scatter away all evil with his look." You're such a great king, you only need to look out upon your land and it will scatter the evil away. Anyway, he then says, considering your great power and wisdom and justice, consider then, most potent Lord, the evils and harms, the perdition and ruin, the equal or likes of which never men were imagined capable of doing. Considering, as I say, those evils, which as a land of 50 years and more experience being in those lands, I have seen committed upon those so many and so great kingdoms, or better said, that entire vast and new world of the Indies, conceded and given in trust by God and his church to the King and Queen of Castile to rule. So he says, "Oh, you're so great, but bad things have been happening in this kingdom that God has given you to rule in the new world. And it has sort of shades of, it was always said that the Russian peasantry believed that if the Tsar only knew, how bad things were, he would redress their problems and solve all their issues. But his evil advisors, never let him know. There's a bit of the same kind of vibe here. Um, anyway, he continues with a bit of frustration here. Uh, the Archbishop of Toledo, teacher of your highness and bishop of Cartagena, he did ask an account of me and presented it to your highness. But because of the long paths of sea and land that your highness has travelled, and the frequent royal occupations your highness has had, it may be that either your highness did not read that account, or has forgotten that your highness has it. So he says, yeah, I've already sent someone to tell you how bad things are. And he continues to describe other occasions he's tried to raise the issue with the king. But every time he says, oh, you must just not have noticed. Your highness has not realized that he has my previous account. So he finishes that he's writing this account at the attention of his highness, and he's summarized it more than previous accounts, which you get the impression were longer. So to be sure that he has the time to take a look this time. It has this very charitable, I assume you don't know what has been happening in your name vibe about all of it.
In the rest of the book, Bartolome recounts report after report of atrocities, enslavement, and needless cruelty inflicted on indigenous peoples. A short account of the destruction of the Indies is a brutal and dehumanizing read. It was immediately seized upon and reprinted many times by colonial rivals of Spain, especially Protestant powers who also opposed Catholic hegemony in the New World, like the English and Dutch. This led to what some historians call the Black Legend, that Spain was an especially cruel colonial power. It was an act of extraordinary courage to allow the publication of this book in the 16th century, a time when printing presses were rare, and this book could easily have been suppressed. In November 1542, the same year Bartolome finished his book, and probably as a direct result of the king reading it, the so-called New Laws were passed. The New Laws of 1542 forbid the enslavement of further Indians and forbade the inheritance of enslaved Indians, so that after the original encomienda holders had died, their slaves would then become free. The new laws sadly did not end slavery in the Spanish Americas. They did not apply to African slaves shipped over from Africa. They only applied to enslaved native people in the Americas. The application of the new laws was also extremely patchy. In Peru, the viceroy attempted to impose the new laws, and this caused an immediate revolt of the rich landowners, who exiled the viceroy back to Spain and soundly defeated a loyalist army raised against them. Loyalist forces were only able to regain control of the colony by repealing the new laws in Peru, which sapped support for the rebel cause. Political opposition in Mexico also led to the new laws being watered down. In particular, the prohibition against inheriting slaves was relaxed for one generation. In theory, no new Indians could be enslaved, but enforcement was often weak. Nevertheless, Bartolome de las Casas' achievement in securing the passage of the new laws makes him one of the most successful human rights campaigners of all time. This anti-slavery legislation in Spain is in 1542. The British Parliament will not abolish the slave trade until 1792, and President Lincoln will not issue the Emancipation Proclamation until 1863, more than 3 centuries later. Although the new laws were far from perfect, slavery was abolished in the Spanish-speaking Americas, a very long time before the English-speaking Americas. So I don't want the English-speaking world to have any misplaced sense of moral superiority. When the Texans declared independence from Mexico and fought the heroic action of Alamo, long celebrated in America as a victory for plucky settlers fighting for freedom from tyranny, one of the key freedoms they were fighting for was the freedom to keep slaves. After the passage of the new laws, Bartolome de las Casas returned again to Mexico and was appointed the Bishop of Chiapas, a state in the south. He was hated by the Spanish landowners for his part in the passage of the new laws. In Chiapas, Bartolome copied the tactics of the Dominican friars on Hispaniola by refusing communion or absolution of their sins to landowners still holding indigenous slaves. This did not improve his popularity, and he was even shot at several times, although he survived these assassination attempts. Bartolome returned to Spain late in life and died in Madrid in 1566. So, our two contemporary sources for the conquest have very different perspectives. Bernal Diaz, who marched with Cortes and views their work as a heroic endeavor to civilize the natives for the glory of Spain, and Bartolome de las Casas, who views the same events as a criminal theft of life, land, goods, and a crime against humanity. We haven't, of course, talked about native accounts of the conquest because they are few and far between, and winners write the history books. But we have a European bias that we should recognise. Anyway, in coming back to a short account of the destruction of the Indies, Bartolome covers only the worst atrocities in each country, and there are only two events that Bartolome writes about in detail in Mexico. The first is the massacre at the Templo Mayor, in which he says that Santiago was the words shouted, the signal to open fire on the crowd. And also the massacre in Cholula. Now, I read the section of the massacre in Cholula earlier. I'm not going to read it again, but I will summarize it. Bartolome says that the Spanish arrived in Cholula. They were welcomed graciously and given fine lodgings and food. They then called the local chiefs for a conference and demanded porters to carry their baggage train. When the porters assembled for duty, carrying only provisions for the journey, they were locked in a courtyard, and every one of them was murdered. They then burned the chiefs alive. According to Bartolome, this was part of a terror strategy intended to intimidate the other tribes into a preemptive submission. Cortes himself reported that 3,000 people were killed in the massacre, but another eyewitness, Vasquez de Tapia, claimed the number was 10 times higher, around 30,000. Bernal Diaz was not present for the massacre at the Templo Mayor, and in fact he says Cortes was furious about it, but Bernal was present for the massacre at Cholula. So what does Bernal Diaz have to say for himself and his companions?
So, what does Bernal Diaz have to say about events in Cholula? Well, quite a lot actually. The passage covers about 10 pages, so I'm not going to read everything that he said. But broadly speaking, what he says is that they arrived in Cholula and they became aware that they were going to be betrayed. So their indigenous allies, the Tlaxcalans, told them that they had seen the Cholulans sacrificing to their idols of war and making preparations for war. And some priests who were Cholulan came and warned the Spanish and were paid with jewels that Montezuma had sent messengers and they had arranged, because the Spanish were trying to go to Tenochtitlan to see Montezuma. Montezuma didn't want them to come at all. So he had apparently arranged an ambush along the path, and the Cholulans were going to lead the Spanish into this ambush and kill them all. And also an old woman who lived in Cholula reached out. They had an interpreter called Malinche, and who was one of the indigenous people. And she was a sort of fairly young girl. And this older woman warned her that she shouldn't go on the march tomorrow with the Spanish because they were all going to be killed. She just wanted to save her. But Malinche reported this to the Spanish, and the priests reported this to the Spanish, and their indigenous allies tipped them off. So they knew that the Cholulans were planning to betray them, which is why when they called for the porters to accompany them on the march, they locked them in a courtyard, explained to them that they were all going to be murdered because of the betrayal, and then they murdered them all and sacked the city. But it wasn't thoughtless. It was revenge for an act of betrayal. albeit an act of betrayal that never actually occurred because they were caught before they could execute it. That does make a bit more sense than Bartolome's account, I will say, because Cortes, while he could be a brutal man, he was generally looking to make friends rather than enemies when he dealt with all the native people. And a random massacre is just out of character for him. So there are other conquistadors who might have done that sort of thing, but Cortes is not one of them. He could be very violent, but always with a purpose. Anyway, interestingly, in his description of events, Bernal Diaz is writing very late in life, so he has the opportunity to answer Bartolome de las Casas directly. So he says, "These were the great cruelties about which the Bishop of Chiapas, Fray Bartolome de las Casas, wrote, and was never tired of talking. He insisted that we punished the Cholulans for no reason at all, or just to amuse ourselves, or because we had a fancy to. He writes so persuasively that he would convince anyone who had not witnessed the event, or had no knowledge of it, that these and the other cruelties of which he writes took place as he says, whereas the reverse is true. Let the Dominicans beware of this book of his, because they will find it contradicts the facts. I should like to say also that some good Franciscans, who were the first friars His Majesty sent to New Spain after the capture of Mexico, went to Cholula to inquire into the details of this punishment and the reasons for it, and they examined the actual papas and the elders of the city. After questioning them thoroughly, they found the facts to conform exactly with the account I have written and not with the bishop's. If we had not inflicted that punishment, our lives would have been in great danger from the companies of Mexican warriors and Cholulans and their barriers and breastworks. And if we had been so unfortunate as to be killed, this New Spain of ours would not have been conquered so rapidly, nor would another armada have dared to set out. Or if it had done so, it would have met with greater difficulties, because the Mexicans would have defended their ports, and they would still have remained in a state of idolatry." So that's Bernal Diaz's account of events. It does make more sense than Fray Bartolome's account of events, but there is one more party I'd like to talk about before we move on from events in Cholula. So far, we've looked at Bernal Diaz's account of events in Cholula and also Fray Bartolome de las Casas' account, but indigenous historians have another perspective. Just before the Spanish arrived in Cholula, they made an alliance with the Tlaxcalans. When Cortes arrived in Cholula, he only had around 200 men, but well over 1,000 Tlaxcalan allies with him. According to the indigenous historians, the Cholulans and the Tlaxcalans had been allies and formed a strong defensive alliance against Mexica aggression and raids. Shortly before the Spanish arrived, though, Cholula switched sides and abandoned the Tlaxcalans, becoming a vassal of the Mexica in exchange for low tribute payments. This left Tlaxcala to face the Mexica alone. So when the Tlaxcalans formed an alliance with the Spanish, they might have wanted to use their new militarily powerful but somewhat naive allies to punish Cholula for their earlier betrayal. There was definitely bad blood between the Cholulans and the Tlaxcalans. In Bernal Diaz's account, the Tlaxcalans are denied entry to the city because the Cholulans don't trust them, and later it is the Tlaxcalans who sack the city with the most violence, and Cortes struggles to restrain his indigenous allies. It is possible that the Cholulans were not planning any betrayal at all, but were set up by the Tlaxcalans, who easily could have convinced the Spanish that the Cholulans were planning to betray them. Further evidence for this theory can be found on a map. The Spanish asked the Tlaxcalans to take them to Tenochtitlan to see Montezuma, but then the Tlaxcalans took them there via Cholula, which was more than a bit out of their way. You have to ask why the Spanish were even in Cholula to begin with. It rather looks like the Tlaxcalans gained a powerful new ally and immediately used them to punish their former allies. We can't say if Cortes was manipulated by his native allies, or if he was complicit and the massacre was necessary to maintain his alliance with Tlaxcala, or even if the Tlaxcalans were actually involved at all. There's just too much time that's passed. When it comes to memorializing this tragic event, you might think a memorial to Bartolome de las Casas would be appropriate, the man who brought the massacre to the attention of the wider world and campaigned all his life to protect indigenous people from exploitation. But of course, we should remember that Bartolome is no saint. He was put forward for beatification in 2002, but never canonized. St. James is a saint, though, so we should probably put up statues and murals of him waving round his sword to remind everyone what happens when you cross the Spanish. Now that we've seen St. James in a couple of churches built on the sites of famous battles and massacres, we have to ask the question, is this systemic? Was St. James placed on every battleground to thank God for the victory and threaten the locals with retribution? Well, to find the answer to that, we have to go to more Mexican churches, so let's do that.